At the height of a luxurious funeral, while everyone wept before the casket, a street girl ignored by all walked through the hall. With something shining in her hands, she faced the powerful millionaire, gathered courage and said, "Uncle, this is not really your wife." Silence took over the place. When the millionaire saw what she was holding, an unimaginable secret came to light, casting doubt on everything he believed, and what happened next left everyone completely in shock. The chill of the concrete night was a silent predator, nipping at Leah's thin skin through the frayed fabric of her coat. At 10 years old, she already knew the language of the city in its cruelest terms. The indifferent sound of hurried footsteps steering clear of her, the smell of hot food escaping from diners like a cruel promise, and the weight of invisibility, which was colder than any wind. Her stomach, an empty, complaining pit, was the clock that governed her days and nights, and now it was screaming. She huddled in the alcove of a commercial building, her large brown eyes scanning the shadows, searching for an opportunity, for a sliver of compassion in a world that seemed to have forgotten her. She'd already tried the back door of a diner, only to be met with a harsh shout to get lost. A well-dressed couple had glanced at her with a mixture of pity and disgust, quickening their pace as if her poverty were contagious. Hope, as fragile as a butterfly's wing, was beginning to crumble. That's when she saw her. The woman emerged from a towering office building, wrapped in a cream-colored wool coat that seemed to radiate warmth. It wasn't the opulence of her clothes or the discreet jewel that glinted on her earlobe that captured Leah's attention, but the aura of serenity that surrounded her. There was a kindness in her posture, a gentle way of looking at the world that contrasted with the rush and hardness of everyone else. Leah's heart hammered against her ribs, a beat of fear and a spark of courage. This was her last chance before the cold won. Gathering every fiber of her strength, she stepped out of the shadows, her small body trembling not just from the cold, but from the dread of imminent rejection. She placed herself in the woman's path, head bowed, her voice little more than a whisper that the wind almost carried away. "Ma'am, excuse me, I'm really hungry." The woman stopped. Leah squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the sidestep, the hand that would push her away, the harsh word. But none of it came. Instead, a soft silence settled, and she felt a pair of gentle eyes upon her. Risking a glance, Leah saw that the woman wasn't looking at her with pity, but with genuine attention. A slight smile touched her lips. "Hello, sweetie." "Of course." The woman opened her leather handbag and pulled out not a few coins, but a neatly wrapped sandwich and a small juice box. She crouched down, bringing herself to Leah's level, and her eyes, a deep blue like the pre-dawn sky, met the girl's. "No one should go hungry." Her voice was like velvet. "Here, I hope this helps." She placed the food into Leah's icy hands, her fingers brushing against the girl's with a surprising warmth. "Have a better night, little one." And with that, she stood, gave one last smile, and continued on her way down the dimly lit sidewalk. Leah stood frozen, clutching the treasure in her hands. It wasn't just food. It was a gesture of humanity that warmed her more than any coat. She retreated to her hiding spot, unwrapping the sandwich with reverent care. Every bite was a piece of heaven, a balm for the ache in her stomach. As she ate slowly, savoring this moment of relief, her eyes followed the figure of the woman walking away. She wanted to burn that face into her memory, the image of her guardian angel. The woman was almost at the corner, under the lonely glow of a streetlight, when a dark, unlit sedan slid silently to the curb beside her. Two shadowy figures leaped from the vehicle. Leah froze, the sandwich halfway to her mouth. Before the woman could react, the men grabbed her. A sharp cry was abruptly muffled by a hand over her mouth. She struggled, a brief, desperate fight in the gloom, before being forced into the car, which sped off and vanished into the darkness, leaving behind only silence and the echo of a terror Leah had just witnessed. The sound of the disappearing car was swallowed by the night's indifference, leaving a silence that screamed louder than the woman's terror. For an instant, Leah's world stopped spinning. The sandwich, her treasure, slipped from her trembling fingers and hit the dirty ground with a dull thud. Forgotten. Her lungs burned, starved for an air she had forgotten to breathe. Fear, an old acquaintance, wrapped around her like a cold cloak. But this was a different fear, sharper and more paralyzing than hunger or cold. She was an expert at going unnoticed, at blending into the shadows, and her primal instinct screamed at her to run, to hide and forget what she had seen. The city was a dangerous place for small, lone girls, and what had just happened was a danger of a magnitude she could barely comprehend. She took a step back, retreating into the safety of her alcove, her heart hammering like a trapped bird. But something stopped her. The image of the woman kneeling, the warmth of her smile, the kindness in her voice. No one should go hungry. Those words echoed in her mind, a beacon of goodness in her bleak life. That woman had seen her. She hadn't been just a blur on the sidewalk, an inconvenience to be ignored. For a brief moment, she had been a person, and that person was now in danger. A wave of nausea washed over her, a mix of fear and a strange, new sense of responsibility. As her mind reeled in panic, a faint glint on the sidewalk caught her eye. Under the yellowed streetlight, something small and sparkling rested near where the woman had struggled. With her heart in her throat, Leah crept out of her hiding place, moving with the caution of a startled animal. She drew closer, her eyes fixed on the object. It was a ring, a delicate gold ring with a small blue stone that seemed to capture and hold the light. She knew it had to belong to the woman. It must have fallen off during the struggle. With fingers still trembling, Leah picked it up. The metal was cold against her skin, but in her imagination, she could still feel the warmth of the woman's hand. It felt heavy, not with gold or stone, but with meaning. It was proof. It was the only thing connecting the real world to the nightmare she had just witnessed. She closed her hand around it, the ring pressing into her palm. What should she do? Go to the police? The thought made her shudder. To the police, she was just another street kid, probably a thief. They wouldn't believe her. They'd look at her with the same suspicion as everyone else. They might even accuse her of stealing the ring. The world wasn't made to listen to girls like her. She looked up and down the empty street. She was alone, utterly alone, with a terrible secret and a valuable ring. Survival instinct told her to toss the ring and run, but the memory of that smile, of that act of pure compassion, held her fast. That woman had saved her from hunger. How could she just turn her back? Clutching the ring tightly, Leah made a decision. She ran, not away from the problem, but toward the only place she called home, an alley behind an old theater where her younger brother, Leo, slept curled in a thin blanket. She had to protect him, but now she felt she also had to protect the memory and the truth of that woman. The ring in her hand was no longer just a piece of jewelry. It was a silent promise, a debt she didn't know how, but felt she had to repay. The run back to the alley was a blur of burning legs and ragged breath. The ring in her hand was a heavy secret, a piece of another life that didn't belong in hers. The alley, her sanctuary of shared misery, felt different, the shadows longer and more menacing. Leo, her 6-year-old brother, was fast asleep, nestled in a cocoon of worn-out blankets and cardboard, oblivious to the terror that had just shaken his sister's world. Leah knelt beside him, her heart still racing. Careful not to wake him, she tucked the ring into the deepest pocket of her jeans, a small pocket she'd sewn herself to keep her most precious treasures, a smooth stone, a shiny button, and now, proof of a crime. She touched Leo's cheek, feeling the warmth of his breath. He was the only good and pure thing in her life, and the thought of the dark men, of the dark car, sent a protective shiver through her. She wouldn't tell him. She couldn't put that burden on his small shoulders. This was a monster she would have to face alone. The next few days dragged on in a haze of fear and unsettling normalcy. Hunger returned as her constant companion, and the routine of scavenging for food and a safe place to sleep resumed its relentless rhythm. But something inside Leah had changed. The city was no longer just indifferent. It was dangerous in a new, specific way. Every dark car that drove by made her flinch. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. The events of that night replayed in her mind like a never-ending film. The woman's smile, the muffled scream, the glint of the ring. Sometimes she wondered if she had imagined it all. Life on the street was hard and could play tricks on a child's mind. Maybe the hunger and the cold had conjured a terrible hallucination. She would touch the ring in her pocket, the metal cool and hard against her fingers, and reality would hit her again. It hadn't been a dream. It was real. It was on the morning of the third day that her world broke in two. Walking past a newsstand, her eyes were drawn to the photo on the front page. It was her, the face of the kind woman, in a professional portrait where she smiled with the same serenity Leah remembered. The girl's heart gave a painful leap. Maybe the news was about her disappearance. Maybe someone was looking for her. With trembling hope, she moved closer, pretending to tie her shoe so she could read the headline. The big black letters hit her like a punch to the gut. High society in mourning. Helena Sterling, wife of billionaire Arthur Sterling, dies tragically. Dies. The words spun in her head, devoid of meaning. What did they mean? Dies. She hadn't died. She'd been taken. Eyes wide, Leah devoured what text she could read. The report spoke of the immense fortune of her husband, Arthur Sterling, a business titan whose wealth was built on an empire of blue-chip stocks and global investments. It mentioned Helena's generosity, her charity work, her kind spirit, and then the lie, printed in black ink and distributed across the city. The cause of death, a sudden, aggressive heart condition that had taken her in a matter of hours. There was no mention of a kidnapping, of hooded men, of a dark car. Just a neat, sad story of a natural tragedy. Leah backed away from the newsstand, the air knocked out of her lungs. The ring in her pocket seemed to burn. The entire world was being told a lie, a massive lie, told by people with so much money and power that no one would dare question it. But she knew the truth. She, the invisible girl no one ever noticed, was the only one who knew that Helena Sterling wasn't dead, and the funeral, announced for the end of the week, wasn't to bury a woman, but to bury the truth. The days leading up to the funeral were the longest of Leah's life. The world felt like a stage, and everyone, unknowingly, was playing their part in a macabre farce. The news of Helena Sterling's death was everywhere, in hushed conversations at bus stops, in magazines left on park benches, in the solemn voices of newscasters seen through the windows of electronics stores. They spoke of her beauty, her charity, the immense void left in the life of her husband, the billionaire Arthur Sterling, a man whose wealth was measured not just in money, but in influence. No one doubted, no one questioned. The narrative was perfect, tragic, and, to Leah, unbearably false. She felt like a ghost, wandering through a city that believed a lie only she could disprove. The ring in her pocket was a constant reminder, a hot coal of truth in a world of ash. The decision to go to the funeral wasn't an act of courage, but of sheer desperation. What else could she do? With each passing day, the kind woman was further away, in more danger, while the world prepared to symbolically bury her. The idea terrified her. Her, a street kid, crashing a high society event. She'd be thrown out, maybe arrested. But the alternative, to do nothing, to let the lie win, was even more frightening. It was a betrayal of the one person who had looked her in the eye and seen a human being. It was a betrayal of herself. On the day of the funeral, she woke before the sun, a knot of dread and determination in her stomach. She looked at Leo, sleeping peacefully. She left him the piece of bread she'd managed to save from the day before and a scrawled note on a piece of cardboard. "Be back soon. Stay here." The walk to Evergreen Memorial Park was a journey through different worlds. She left behind the grey, grimy streets of her daily life and entered the wealthy neighborhoods. With their imposing houses, manicured lawns, and a silence that felt expensive, the cemetery itself was more beautiful than any park she had ever seen. It was not a place of sadness, but a monument to wealth, with mausoleums that looked like small mansions and lawns so green they seemed painted. Luxury cars, black and gleaming, formed an endless line outside the wrought iron gates. Men in dark suits and women in elegant hats and discreet veils entered silently, their faces composed in grief. Leah hid behind a large hedge, her heart thumping erratically. She was a stain on this picture of perfection and restrained sorrow. How could she possibly get past the stern-looking security guards at the entrance? She watched, using the skill the street had taught her, find the gaps, the moments of distraction. A large group of people arrived, causing a minor bottleneck at the entrance as security checked names. It was her chance. Small and nimble, she slipped behind a car, used the shadow of a large man, and with her heart in her mouth, slid into the cemetery unnoticed. Once inside, she blended into the shadows of the trees, moving from headstone to headstone, closing in on the crowd gathered around a white tent. The air was heavy with the scent of lilies and the sound of a violin playing a sad melody. She saw the widower, Arthur Sterling, standing beside the open casket. His face was a mask of grief. He was the man whose financial empire included vast assets and an enviable cash flow. He looked genuinely devastated. For a second, doubt assailed her. What if she was wrong? What if it was all a terrible coincidence? But then she saw the woman in the casket. She looked similar, very similar, but something was off. The chin was a little more square, the nose subtly different, and on her hand rested a ring with a blue stone that, even from a distance, looked dull, lifeless. It wasn't the ring she held. Hers sparkled. The casket, draped in white lilies, began to move, carried by men in white gloves. The moment was coming. It was now or never. Panic rose in Leah's throat like bitter bile. They were going to bury her. They were going to shovel dirt over a lie, sealing the real Helena's fate. The violin's melody seemed to intensify, weaving a shroud of sound over the scene. Every step of the pallbearers toward the open grave was a hammer blow against her chest. The millionaire's face, Arthur Sterling's, contorted in what looked like authentic pain, confused her. Did he not know? Was he being deceived too, or was he part of it? The questions spun in her head, so dizzying they made her lightheaded. She looked around at the faces of the guests. They were like statues of mourning, wealthy and powerful figures immersed in their own sorrow, blind to the truth right in front of them. To them, she was less than the wind, an invisible presence with no place in their world of capital and dividends. Anger, pure and hot, began to bubble under the fear. Anger at the injustice, at how easily the truth could be bought and sold. That woman had been good to her. In that brief encounter, she had offered Leah more humanity than most people had in her entire life. To let her disappear into a grave of lies was unthinkable. The loyalty she felt to that simple act of kindness was a fierce force inside her, stronger than the fear of humiliation, stronger than the instinct for self-preservation. The ring in her pocket seemed to pulse, a metal heart demanding action. It was her only weapon, her only proof. She had to try, even if they threw her out, even if they called her crazy, she had to scream the truth. With a gasp that seemed to pull all the courage from her lungs, Leah burst from her hiding spot. She ran across the perfectly trimmed grass, a comet of ragged clothes and tangled hair tearing through the funereal solemnity. A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd as they saw her. Heads turned, eyes widened. The security guards, posted at the edges of the ceremony, reacted instantly, moving to intercept her, but she was fast, fueled by desperation. She dodged an outstretched hand, darted past a veiled woman who let out a muffled shriek, and didn't stop until she reached the edge of the grave. Just feet from the casket being positioned to be lowered, she threw up her arms, her small hands trembling, her voice coming out in a sharp, piercing cry that cut through the air like shattering glass. "Stop! Stop the funeral!" The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and shocking. The violin stopped mid-note. The pallbearers froze. The casket, hovering precariously over the dark hole. Every eye, hundreds of pairs of eyes, was fixed on her. Arthur Sterling turned, his face pale and confused, his grief giving way to irritated bewilderment. The guards reached her, firm hands grabbing her small arms. "Get this child out of here!" a severe voice ordered. Leah struggled, planting her feet. "No, you don't understand. She's alive. The one in the casket isn't her." The words tumbled out. Full of panic and urgency, a buzz of outrage and pity spread through the crowd. "Poor girl," someone whispered. "She must be disturbed." "How disrespectful," said another. Arthur Sterling took a step forward, his face a mask of disbelief and anger. "What is this? What is this nonsense?" His voice, accustomed to commanding boardrooms and closing multi-million-dollar deals, trembled with a mixture of grief and fury. "Security, please escort her out. Gently, but remove her." The hands on her arms tightened, beginning to drag her away. Desperation flooded her. They weren't listening. They wouldn't believe her. In a final act of defiance, she dug her hand into her pocket, pulled out the ring, and held it aloft, the small blue stone catching the sunlight. "Wait, I have proof. The ring. I have the real ring." The ring, held high in Leah's trembling hand, glinted under the pale morning sun, a defiant speck of light in the solemn gloom. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The guards' hands hesitated on her arms, their brute force momentarily neutralized by the girl's sheer audacity. The murmur of the crowd turned into a tense, curious silence. All eyes, once filled with outrage or pity, were now fixed on the small jewel she held. The claim was so absurd, so out of place, that it broke through the barrier of grief and social etiquette, sparking a flicker of intrigue. It was the intrusion of the impossible into the ritual of pain. The hostility of the guests still hung in the air, thick as the morning humidity. She could feel their stares, judging her, condemning her for desecrating such a sacred moment. "This is an outrage," a man with a grey mustache said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Someone control that child." Arthur Sterling, however, had frozen. His eyes, once clouded with sorrow, were now sharp, focused intently on the ring in Leah's hand. His jaw tightened. That sparkle, the specific cut of the stone, there was something terribly familiar about it. To anyone else, it could be any ring, but to him, it was an image seared into his memory. He raised a hand, a subtle but commanding gesture that halted the guards. "Wait." His voice was low, but it carried an authority no one would dare challenge. He approached slowly, his expensive shoes sinking into the soft grass. The crowd held its collective breath. He stopped a few feet from Leah, his blue eyes, so like the woman's who had helped her, scanning her from head to toe. He saw the grime on her face, the worn clothes, the fear and defiance warring in her eyes. She was the embodiment of everything his world of wealth and order kept at a distance. Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice raw, almost a whisper. The fury had vanished, replaced by a deep, painful confusion. Leah swallowed hard, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was the moment of truth. If he didn't believe her, it was all over. She gave it to me. No, not gave it. It fell. It fell when those men took her. The words rushed out, a torrent of information she had been holding for days. She gave me a sandwich. She was nice to me. And then they took her, forced her into a dark car. She screamed. And the ring fell. I picked it up. That one. She jutted her chin toward the casket. That's not her. Her ring is different. It doesn't shine like this. Arthur Sterling's face turned ashen, the color draining away until he looked as lifeless as the figure in the coffin. He held out his hand, not to take the ring, but as a silent request. Let me see. Leah hesitated for a fraction of a second. That ring was her only protection, her only currency in a world that gave her nothing. But looking into his eyes, she saw not the threat of a powerful billionaire, but the agony of a man at the edge of an abyss. With her heart in her throat, she placed the ring in his outstretched palm. Arthur took it, his long, slender fingers closing over the small jewel. He turned it over, examining it in the sunlight. And then he did something no one expected. He brought it closer to his eye, angling the inner band toward the light. A choked sound escaped his lips, his shoulders slumped, and he staggered back as if he'd taken a physical blow. Inside the ring, visible only to someone who knew where to look, was a tiny engraving, a private joke between him and Helena, their initials intertwined with an infinity symbol, a detail no one else could possibly know, a detail the lifeless copy on the doppelganger's finger certainly did not have. He lifted his eyes from the ring to Leah, and in them was no longer anger or disbelief, but a dawning terror and a desperate question he didn't dare ask aloud. Arthur Sterling's world, a world built on the certainty of numbers, the cold logic of investments, and the predictability of profit, cracked and fell apart in that instant. The tiny engraving inside the ring wasn't just proof. It was the key that unlocked a series of disturbing anomalies his grief had prevented him from seeing. The speed with which the family doctor, a man he barely knew, had signed the death certificate. The lawyer's insistence that the funeral arrangements be immediate, citing the need to protect his vast estate from media speculation. The subtle but persistent feeling that the woman lying in the casket was a stranger, a wax doll that mimicked his Helena but lacked her soul. It all clicked into place with the terrifying precision of a closing trap. He was being played, masterfully, cruelly played. The pain in his chest transformed into an icy fury, a dangerous energy that cleared his mind and stiffened his spine. He raised his head, and the man who looked out at the shocked crowd was no longer the devastated widower, but the ruthless billionaire who had built an empire. His eyes swept over the faces, searching for a sign of betrayal, a hidden complicity. "This ceremony is over," he announced, his voice resonating with an authority that froze any protest before it could even form. He turned to the men still holding the casket. "Close it. Take it back to the hearse. Now." Shock gave way to confusion. An older man, a relative of Helena's, approached cautiously. "Arthur, my dear boy, what are you doing? The grief is affecting your judgment. Let's finish this. Give her the rest she deserves." Arthur leveled a glare at him so sharp the man recoiled. "She is not dead," he said, the words falling like chips of ice. Then he turned to Leah. The guards had released her arms, unsure how to proceed. Arthur held out his hand to the girl, the same hand that now clutched the ring. The gesture wasn't gentle, but it wasn't threatening either. It was urgent. You're coming with me." Without waiting for a reply, he took Leah's small, grimy hand. The contrast between his skin, accustomed to signing million-dollar contracts, and hers, calloused by survival, was stark. He pulled her along with him, marching away from the open grave, away from the casket, away from the lie he had almost swallowed. The crowd parted for them, a sea of bewildered faces and scandalous whispers. "He's lost his mind. It's the shock. And who is that girl?" Arthur ignored them all. His mind was already working, calculating, strategizing. Every second counted. Helena was alive, somewhere, and in danger. He could feel it. The girl beside him was the only lead, the only ally he could trust. He led her to his waiting black limousine, gleaming and silent. The driver, seeing them approach, jumped out to open the door, his face a mask of impassive professionalism despite the chaos unfolding behind them. Arthur gently guided Leah inside the car, the interior of cream leather and polished wood, a seemingly alien universe to the girl. He got in after her, closing the door and sealing them off from the world. "Drive," he ordered the chauffeur, "to the estate, fast." The car glided away from the cemetery, leaving behind a funeral in ruins and a scandal about to erupt. Inside the silence of the vehicle, Arthur turned to the small figure huddled on the seat. He looked at her, truly looked, and saw not a street kid, but the only person in the entire world who had told him the truth. His voice, now devoid of all anger, was low and intense. "Now," he said, leaning forward, "tell me everything. Do not leave out a single detail." The drive to the estate was made in a thick, charged silence. Leah felt herself sinking into the plush leather seat, a contrast so violent with the park benches and stairwells, she knew that it felt like being on another planet. The car moved with an unreal smoothness, gliding through the streets she used to trudge along on foot, hungry and invisible. Now she sat beside one of the country's wealthiest men, a man whose fortune was a whispered legend in business circles, built on a diverse portfolio of stocks and global investments. He didn't speak, just stared out the window, Helena's ring still clutched in his hand, his face an impenetrable mask. Leah shrank into her corner, afraid of dirtying the immaculate upholstery, afraid of breathing too loud. The car finally stopped before monumental iron gates that swung open without a sound, revealing a house that wasn't a house, but a palace. It was surrounded by grounds so vast and perfect they looked like a painting. As they entered, the echo of their footsteps in the polished marble foyer seemed deafening. The ceiling was so high, it looked like it could swallow the sky, and Leah felt as small as a speck of dust. A woman in a black and white uniform, her hair in a severe bun, approached, her face pale with worry. "Mr. Sterling, thank God you're back. The phone hasn't stopped ringing. Everyone is—" She stopped short, her eyes falling on Leah with an expression of astonishment and disapproval. "Who is this?" Arthur ignored her. "Take us to my study, Elvira, and bring a glass of milk and something for her to eat, immediately." The woman, Elvira, looked like she wanted to protest, but the steel in Arthur's voice silenced her. She led them down a hallway, adorned with paintings Leah guessed were worth more money than she would ever see. The study was an immense room, lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a mahogany desk as large as Leah and Leo's makeshift bed. Arthur sat in his leather chair and gestured for Leah to sit in the armchair opposite him. She obeyed, feeling swallowed by the furniture. He steepled his fingers on the desk, the ring now sitting next to a silver inkwell. "Start from the beginning," he said, his voice controlled but vibrating with an intensity that made her shiver. "I want every detail." What she said, what the men said, what they looked like, what the car looked like, everything. Leah, her voice trembling, began to tell her story. She spoke of the hunger, of Helena's kindness, the sandwich, the smile. She described the men as shadows, their voices muffled, the cry cut short. She spoke with the desperate clarity of someone who knows her life and someone else's depends on these words. Elvira entered with a tray, placing a glass of milk and a plate of cookies on the small table beside Leah with a sharp click, without so much as a glance at the girl. Arthur noticed the tremor in Leah's hands and the way she stared at the food with a starved longing. His expression softened for a fraction of a second. "Eat, child," he said, more gently. "You need your strength." As Leah hesitated, the phone on Arthur's desk rang shrilly. He answered, his voice turning sharp again. "Yes. No. I have not lost my mind. Cancel everything. I don't want to speak to the press. Just do as I say." He hung up forcefully. The pressure from the outside world was beginning to breach his fortress. He turned back to Leah, about to continue, when Elvira, who had remained standing by the door, cleared her throat. "Mr. Sterling, forgive my insistence, but there is something else. Something I should have mentioned before. But with all the confusion—" Arthur looked at her impatiently. "Speak, Elvira." The housekeeper wrung her hands in her apron. "This morning, while preparing the house, I found something in the guest room of the East Wing, the one that is never used. The door was locked, which I found odd. I have the master key, and inside, sir, I found a set of Mrs. Sterling's clothes, hidden in the back of the closet." Elvira's revelation hung in the rarefied air of the study, more shocking than any shout at the cemetery. Clothes, hidden in a locked room. Every word was a puzzle piece clicking into a sickeningly clear picture. The kidnapping hadn't been a random act of violence. It had been planned, orchestrated from inside his own home, the sanctuary his immense fortune should have made impenetrable. Arthur felt a wave of cold wash over him, a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. It was the cold of betrayal. He, who managed a net worth in the billions, who analyzed the profitability of every investment and protected his assets with a team of the best lawyers, had been betrayed in the most intimate and devastating way. Someone in his trusted circle, someone with access to his home and his life, was a wolf in sheep's clothing. "Show me," he said, his voice dangerously calm. He rose, rounding the mahogany desk. His gaze met Leah's, and for an instant they shared a silent understanding. She was no longer an intruder. She was his only anchor to reality in a sea of deception. "You're coming too," he said to her, the tone making it clear it was not an invitation, but a necessity. He needed her eyes, the eyes that saw the truth when everyone else was blind. Elvira, pale and trembling, led them out of the study. They walked through silent halls, past artwork worth more than small countries and rugs that muffled their footsteps, creating a suffocating atmosphere of suspense. Leah had never imagined so much wealth could exist, but she was now seeing that all the money in the world couldn't buy safety or loyalty. The East Wing was quiet and dusty, rarely visited. Elvira stopped before a dark wood door and, with shaking hands, inserted an old key into the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a pristine room, covered in white dust sheets like a ghost waiting for a guest who would never arrive. The air was still and lifeless. "In the closet," the housekeeper whispered, pointing. Arthur crossed the room in 3 long strides and threw open the closet doors. At first, it appeared empty, save for some extra blankets, but he knelt and, in the very back, behind a stack of quilts, he found a small bundle wrapped in a sheet. Carefully, he pulled it out and unfolded it on the floor. It was Helena's clothing, a simple linen dress and a pair of flat shoes, the very clothes she was wearing on the day she had vanished from the face of the earth, according to the story he himself had told the police. Based on what he'd been told, her faint scent still clung to the fabric, a hint of jasmine that hit him like a fist. She had been alive. Here, in this house, after she had been declared dead, the proof was irrefutable. The doppelganger had been put in her place, while the real Helena was held captive somewhere else. Who? Why? The question burned in his mind. The motive had to be control over his business, access to his capital, perhaps a move to force a merger or a sale of assets. As he stared at the clothes, the cell phone in his pocket vibrated, a sharp, intrusive sound in the silent room. He pulled it out, frowning at the caller ID. It was a number he hadn't seen in years. Ricardo Vargas, his former business partner. A brilliant and ambitious man, he'd been forced to oust from the company over disagreements on business ethics and high-risk crypto investments. Ricardo had always believed the ends justified the means. Arthur answered, instinct telling him this was no coincidence. "Arthur," came the smooth, controlled voice on the other end, a voice he detested. "I heard about the tragedy. My condolences. I know this is a terrible time, but we need to talk about the future of the business and about Helena." The mention of Helena's name, spoken with that calculated familiarity by a man he hadn't seen in nearly 5 years, sent an electric shock up Arthur's spine. This wasn't a condolence call, it was a move. Ricardo Vargas, with his impeccable timing and flexible morals, wouldn't make a move like this without a purpose. He was probing, testing the waters, perhaps even reveling in the situation. The suspicion, once a formless fog in Arthur's mind, began to solidify, taking the shape of his former partner's smiling, predatory face. Ricardo was the only person with enough knowledge of his business and the audacity to orchestrate something this complex. Their falling out hadn't just been about money, it was a battle of philosophies. Arthur built his empire patiently, analyzing the stock market, investing in treasuries and safe assets. Ricardo wanted the quick profit, the risky shortcuts, the dangerous game of high-risk hedge funds and volatile digital currencies like Bitcoin. "There's nothing to talk about, Ricardo," Arthur replied, his voice cold as steel. He gestured for Elvira and Leah to leave the room. Wanting privacy for this verbal sparring match, he heard the door click softly shut behind him. "You are no longer a part of this company, or my life." A low, smug chuckle came from the other end. "Come now, Arthur. Don't be sentimental. Helena was always the heart of the operation. You were the brains. Without her, the empire is vulnerable. Investors get nervous. The stock could dip. I can help stabilize things. Think of it as a legacy of our old partnership." Every word was a knife disguised as an offer. Ricardo was revealing his hand, showing he knew more than he should. He was using Helena's supposed death as leverage. Arthur felt the rage rise but suppressed it. Rage was an emotion Ricardo knew how to manipulate. He needed calm, strategy. "I appreciate your concern," Arthur said, choosing his words carefully, "but I have everything under control. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a funeral to rearrange." He was about to hang up when Ricardo delivered the line that confirmed everything. "Be careful, Arthur. Sometimes things aren't what they seem, and losses can be greater than you imagine, affecting your entire net worth." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. He ended the call, his hand trembling slightly. Ricardo was involved. He was sure of it, but how to prove it? He needed more than a hunch. He needed a mistake, a loose thread. He walked out of the room, his mind racing. He found Leah and Elvira waiting in the hall, their faces anxious. He looked at the housekeeper. "Elvira, who else has access to this house?" "Besides the regular staff," Elvira thought, her face wrinkled in concentration. "Well, sir, for the last few days, with the arrangements, the lawyers have been here, the team from the funeral home, and the extra security guard the agency sent. The one you hired for the funeral. An extra security guard, another piece." "Where is he now?" Arthur asked. "I believe he's on duty at the back gate," the housekeeper replied. An idea began to form in Arthur's mind, dangerous and uncertain. He turned to Leah. "Leah," he said, his voice low and urgent, "I need you to do something for me, something only you can do. You're good at not being seen, at watching. I need you to watch that guard. Stay far away. Don't let him see you. Just watch him. Anything strange, anything out of the ordinary, you come and tell me." He knew he was asking a lot of a child, placing her in potential risk, but her eyes, steady and determined, told him she understood. She was no longer just a victim or a witness. She was a part of this, and she wouldn't back down. Taking on the mission Arthur had given her transformed Leah's fear into a sharp-edged purpose. The vast, intimidating estate, with its labyrinthine gardens and silent hallways, became her new hunting ground. She was a shadow, a whisper, moving with the stealthy agility that life on the streets had taught her. She left behind the hungry, frightened girl, In her place emerged a small spy with an iron will. The safety of Helena, the woman who had shown her kindness, depended on her. Arthur led her to a back window overlooking the service gate, pointing out the man she was to watch. He was a burly man with broad shoulders and a bored expression, standing in a stiff posture near the iron gate. He looked harmless, just another uniform in a landscape of wealth. But Leah knew appearances were deceiving. The street had taught her to read people not by their clothes, but by their gestures, by the way their eyes darted, by the tension in their shoulders. She found the perfect hiding spot, an old, ivy-covered gazebo at the edge of the garden, which offered a clear view of the gate while keeping her completely concealed. From there she watched. The hours crawled by. The guard paced back and forth, checked his phone, yawned. Leah felt doubt begin to creep in. What if she was wrong? What if he was just a man doing his job? But the memory of Arthur's face, the urgency in his voice, kept her still. Patience was another lesson from the street. Waiting for the right opportunity was a matter of survival. The sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, when the guard's routine finally broke. A plain car, an old, dented sedan that was completely out of place in the luxurious neighborhood, pulled up just outside the gate. The guard glanced around, a quick, nervous check, before opening a small slit in the gate and slipping out onto the street. Leah held her breath, her heart picking up its pace. She shrank further into the ivy leaves. The driver of the car didn't get out. He just rolled down the window. The guard leaned in, and a short, muffled conversation took place. Then, something changed hands. Leah squinted, straining her eyes in the fading twilight. It was an envelope, thick and white. The guard quickly stuffed it into the inside pocket of his jacket. The conversation continued for another moment. The wind shifted, carrying fragments of their voices to Leah's hiding place. The words were few, but they were loaded. "Keep everything under control," the guard said, his voice low and tense. The man in the car replied, his voice rougher, "Until the transfer is complete. No mistakes. Transfer." The word sounded alarming in Leah's mind. Were they talking about a transfer of money, of assets, or of a person? The car drove off as discreetly as it had arrived. The guard slipped back inside the gates, his face now taut, the posture of boredom replaced by a nervous vigilance. Leah knew she had it. This was more than suspicion. It was proof of a connection, a link between the house's security and an unknown outside force. She waited a few minutes, making sure the guard wouldn't see her leave, then darted back towards the mansion, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and triumph. She found Arthur in his study, pacing like a caged animal. The room was dark, save for the glow of a desk lamp that cast long, dancing shadows. "He met someone," Leah said, breathless. "A man in a car. He took an envelope. I heard what they said." She repeated the conversation, word for word, her sharp memory having recorded every detail. They talked about a transfer. Arthur's face hardened, setting into a mask of controlled fury. Transfer. The word echoed Ricardo's veiled threat about his business, his stocks, his entire estate. This was what it was all about, seizing control of his financial empire, and Helena was the pawn at the center of the game. He knelt in front of Leah, placing his hands on her shoulders. "You have been unbelievably brave," he said, his voice thick with genuine gratitude. "Now, I need to make some calls. You stay here. Do not leave this study." He moved to the phone, but before he could dial, the door flew open. One of the family lawyers, a man named Mr. Peterson, hurried in, his face flushed with agitation, followed by other family members. "Arthur, this has gone far enough," the lawyer boomed, his voice loud and condescending. "Calling off the funeral, bringing this child into your home. We're getting calls from board members, from business partners. Your emotional stability is being questioned. You are putting your entire estate at risk over the fantasy of a street urchin." Mr. Peterson's accusation, amplified by the disapproving presence of the family, filled the study with a crushing pressure. Leah shrank back in the armchair, feeling once again like the invisible girl, the intruder whose truth was treated like trash. The lawyer's words were like stones thrown to discredit her, to paint her as a delusional opportunist. She saw the doubt in the eyes of Arthur's relatives, the way they looked from her to him as if he had succumbed to a contagious madness. Her entire castle of courage, built from the moment she had crashed the funeral, threatened to crumble. She was putting this man, who had finally listened to her, in a terrible position, forcing him to choose between her and his world, between the word of a homeless child and the cold logic of business and assets. But Arthur did not flinch. He turned to face the lawyer, and the man who answered was not the confused client Mr. Peterson expected to manipulate, but the corporate predator who had built an empire from nothing. A dangerous calm settled over him. "Emotional stability," he repeated, his voice a low hiss. "My wife has been kidnapped, replaced with a body double, and nearly buried alive, and you talk to me about my stock prices. You talk to me about the opinion of a board that only cares about dividends." He took a step forward, his presence filling the room. "While you were all worrying about assets and liabilities, I almost lost my most valuable one. And it was this girl, this child you despise, who had the courage to tell me the truth." It was then, as he spoke the words stocks and business, that the final piece of the puzzle snapped into place in his mind with blinding clarity. The transfer. It wasn't about him. It was about Helena. He remembered a conversation weeks before this happened. Helena, who ran one of the largest charity funds financed by his company, had been worried. She'd mentioned irregularities, a strange cash flow, a suspicion of a large-scale embezzlement scheme. He, immersed in his own deals, had placated her, telling her he'd look into it, but hadn't given it his full attention. Ricardo Vargas. He didn't just want control of the company, he was stealing from it on the inside, through Helena's charity funds. She had found out, and so she had to be silenced. Not killed, because her death would trigger audits, but disappeared, replaced, while the final transfer of the stolen capital was completed. The cruelty of the plan took his breath away. It wasn't just greed, it was the destruction of his wife's legacy of kindness. Ignoring the lawyer's protests, Arthur grabbed his cell phone. His face was a mask of deadly resolve. He found Ricardo's number and activated the record function. With his finger hovering over the call button, he looked at Leah, an apology and a promise in his eyes. He dialed. The phone rang twice before Ricardo answered, his voice smug. "Changed your mind, Arthur." "It's over, Ricardo," Arthur said, his voice as solid as bedrock. "I have everything. Helena left copies of the audit records with a third party. The police are on their way to your office right now. They know all about the embezzlement scheme, about the fraudulent transfer you were about to finalize." There was a dead silence on the other end. Arthur could almost hear the gears in Ricardo's mind grinding in panic. The lie was plausible, desperately plausible. You're bluffing," Ricardo stammered, his arrogance dissolving. "Am I?" Arthur shot back. "Then why is the security guard you paid off already confessing everything? He told us where she is, Ricardo." It was the final blow. A choked, panicked sound came down the line. "That idiot, he wasn't supposed to talk. You won't find her in time. I'll disappear with everything, with all the money, and you'll never see her again." Arthur said nothing more. The confession, the threat, the admission of guilt, it was all there. He ended the call and stopped the recording. The study was utterly silent. Mr. Peterson and the family stared at him, mouths agape. The reality of the situation finally crashing down on them like an anvil. Arthur looked at his cell phone screen, at the small audio file that held one man's ruin and the only hope for his wife's salvation. The small audio file on Arthur's phone was a bomb. In the ensuing silence, the sound of his own breathing seemed too loud. The faces of Mr. Peterson and the relatives had turned from shock to dread, the understanding of what they had just witnessed hitting them in waves. They weren't dealing with a grieving, crazed man. They were in the presence of a husband waging a war. Arthur didn't give them a second glance. His focus was singularly fixed on the task ahead. With a calm that chilled everyone in the room, he made a single call, not to the local police, but to the head of security for his global conglomerate, a former federal agent whose loyalty was absolute. He transmitted the recording and the information about the guard, speaking in a rapid, efficient code of names and locations. The machine his vast fortune could command was set in motion, not with bureaucracy, but with the precision of a surgical strike. "Get out of my house, Peterson," Arthur said, hanging up and turning to the lawyer. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a final judgment. "Your concern for my estate almost cost me my wife. Consider your services terminated." The lawyer opened his mouth to protest, but Arthur's glare made him back away and exit the study in silence, followed by the shamed relatives. The door clicked shut, leaving only Arthur and Leah in the sanctuary of mahogany and leather. The power and wealth that had once seemed so distant to Leah was now a tangible force, a weapon being wielded for justice. The wait that followed was the longest of their lives. The clock on the wall ticked, each second stretching into an eternity. Arthur didn't sit. He stood by the window, staring out into the darkness, the lights of the city glittering in the distance. He turned to Leah, who remained huddled in the armchair. He walked over and perched on the edge of his desk, bringing himself to her level. "I can never thank you enough," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I have armies of people paid to protect me, to manage my assets, to advise me, and they all failed. They all saw what they wanted to see. But you saw the truth. Why did you risk so much, Leah?" She looked down at her own small, grubby hands. "Because she was good to me," she whispered. "She gave me food. She smiled. She saw me." In the simplicity of those words, Arthur understood everything. His wife's salvation hadn't come from his money or power, but from a single act of compassion she had offered to an invisible child. Helena's generosity had become her most valuable insurance policy. The phone rang, the sound making them both jump. Arthur snatched it on the first ring. He listened, his entire body tense. Leah watched his face, searching for any sign. A minute passed, and then Arthur's shoulders sagged, a wave of relief so powerful he had to brace himself against the desk. The tears he had held back so fiercely at the fake funeral finally welled in his eyes. "They found her," he said, his voice breaking as he turned to Leah. "They got him. Ricardo is in custody, and Helena, she's safe. She's shaken, but she's alive." The relief was so overwhelming that Leah felt her own tears track clean paths down her dusty cheeks. She had done it. The kind woman was safe. The first victory had been won. Justice was beginning to unfold, with the guard being taken in and accomplices being identified. The lie had been undone, and amid the maelstrom of emotion, a single certainty formed in Arthur's heart as he looked at the small figure who had saved his world. Nothing would ever be the same again. Helena was coming home. 3 weeks. That's how long it took for the world to spin and settle on a new axis. The interrupted funeral already felt like a memory from another life, a fever dream that had given way to a slow, sunlit awakening. The gardens of the Sterling estate were a universe of colors and scents Leah never knew existed. The grass tickled her bare feet, and the sun, once just a reminder of the relentless heat of the pavement, was now a warm embrace on her shoulders. She watched Leo, her little brother, who was lying on his stomach in the grass, drawing in a sketchbook with a box of colored pencils that had more shades than he could name. The sound of his laughter, pure and free, echoed among the rose bushes, a sound Leah realized she had rarely heard on the streets. Hunger was a distant memory, fear, a ghost that lost its power with each new day. Here, There was only peace and the strange, wonderful feeling of safety. Helena and Arthur approached, walking hand in hand. Helena's recovery had been a slow process. There were shadows in her eyes that hadn't been there before, but each day her inner light shone a little brighter, fueled by relief and love. She sat on the grass beside Leah. Her smile, still the same gesture of pure kindness the girl remembered from that cold night. "Look at the artist we have here," she said softly, admiring Leo's drawing. Arthur remained standing, gazing down at the two children, and a profound transformation was visible on his face. The hard edge of the billionaire had softened, replaced by a humility he hadn't known he possessed. He had learned the hard way that his vast fortune, his assets and portfolios, were just numbers on a spreadsheet. A man's true net worth was measured in the bonds he formed, in the truth he defended. He had nearly lost everything, deceived by those who coveted his money, and had been saved by a girl who had nothing. "Leah," Arthur said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Helena and I have been talking a lot about the future, about family." He knelt, so his eyes were level with hers. "This house is big and empty. We don't want you to leave, ever. We would like, if you and Leo would let us, to be your family." The words hung in the air, as delicate and precious as a butterfly. It wasn't an offer of charity, of a roof and food. It was an offer of belonging, of a home. Leah looked at Arthur's face, then at Helena's, who had tears shining in her eyes. She looked over at Leo, who was now drawing 4 stick figures holding hands under a smiling yellow sun. And for the first time in her life, Leah let herself dream of a future that went beyond the next meal. She said nothing. She just reached out her hand and placed it on top of Helena's, a small gesture that held a universe of acceptance and hope. That night, for the first time, Leah slept in a real bed under a soft duvet that smelled of lavender. She didn't have to curl up against the cold or wake with a start at the city's noises. Through the window, she could see the stars, not the harsh glare of streetlights. The girl who had lived in the shadows, invisible to the world, had discovered her voice had the power to stop funerals and save lives. The billionaire who had almost been consumed by a web of lies had learned that the purest truth can come from the humblest heart. And the woman whose kindness had planted a seed of loyalty discovered that the greatest investment she ever made wasn't in the stock market, but in the sandwich she gave to a hungry child. The funeral meant to bury a lie became the birthplace of a new family, proving that courage has no size and that justice sometimes finds its way in the most unexpected places.